Welcome to ANT1 TLC Lecture 9 entitled Governmentality. The idea we're going to look at this week is that the way governments care also creates control. So, what's the context of this lecture? We have seen from week 1 that care is not merely biological, it is also cultural and social. Secondly, care is never neutral. It is organised along lines of kinship, including gender, age, affinity and consanguinity, matriline and patriline. Care is also organised along lines of gift giving. We have found out that you're obliged to engage in care, and when you do that, other people are obligated to you as well. We've seen that care incorporates non-human persons in relation to pigs and goats and bears. We've seen that care is embodied in relation to a Thai mother looking after her mother. We've seen the way that care is gendered. In relation to the feminization of care labour, fathers with cognitively disabled children have to reassess their own roles. We've looked at the structures that affect the lives of care workers, of Filipina and Indonesian women working in Japan and in Taiwan. We've also seen that in relation to these sort of structures of international labour, they also exhibit some forms of agency. And finally, last week we looked at how care can be violent. This week we're going to look at what happens when state authorities provide care and the other kinds of powers and relationships that emerge. In general, the course now is moving from a relational mode. So early in the subject, we encountered care as something deeply relational that was built through, for example, kinship roles, mothers, uncles, and cross cousins. We also saw it in relation to gifts and reciprocities, in relation to remittances and saludos. We've also seen this deeply personal in relation between humans and non-humans. And we've also seen how it is embodied. And this is not, even though we've looked at the relational mode, we've seen that it's also problematical. There's the discipline, for example, of the father or the mother's brother. There's the ingratiation that goes along with the gift exchange and reciprocity. Or there's this kind of autopilot element of mundane care in Thailand. So this is not a move from good care to bad care by any means at all. However, we are moving from a relational mode to more of an organizational mode. We're looking at state care organizations such as hospitals, departments of health, schools, and prisons. Now, what concepts can we use to analyze this kind of care? The older notions we looked at, like the kinship and the gift, are not particularly useful. So we need some other analytical tools in our toolkit. And thankfully, we have the ideas of governmentality and panopticism, which Foucault and a lot of thinkers who agree with him think are very useful for understanding state care. So what is this state care? Foucault explains how it emerged in the modern period. So for anthropologists, modernity starts, believe it or not, in 1500 more or less. So by the late 1600s, we're well within the modern period of Europe's history. And he talks about how the plan that a town had created for dealing with plague. Each individual is fixed in his place, in his home. Everyone at his window answering to his name. As an authority walks through the streets, they'll yell out your name, you have to respond. If you don't respond, that's almost, I think, subject to punishment. It's a great review of the living and the dead because you have to call out who's dead in your house and so on. So what we have there is a really severe lockdown plan. And when this happens, this plan includes the spatial partitioning of households. So people are not supposed to, there's no relationship between houses. Food is dropped off out the front and pulled up by a pulley. And there's constant surveillance and reporting by the authorities who walk through the streets. Individuals are reduced to roles, such as, guarding the town, names, and diseases. So this is a new way for dealing with the plague and probably an effective way for dealing with the plague too. However, this is, we could see as the beginning of what Foucault calls a disciplinary society, where power and care manage life by locating, isolating, and observing. Locating people in certain houses, isolating them there, and making them observable. So that's how we could say that this plan occurs at the beginning of the disciplinary society in the West. Another example of this comes almost 100 years later with a great philosopher by the name of Bentham, Jeremy Bentham. You might have heard of him if you're doing politics or the political philosophy. Bentham described a model prison, a prison for the future. And the idea of this model prison was that in a central guard tower, a guard would sit. And then all the inmates would be arranged as individualized in their cells. Now, when you're in one of these cells, you're subject to the gaze of the warden. And you don't even know if the warden is there. In fact, ideally, the warden doesn't need to be there. But you, being an inmate, know that you are visible, that you are what he calls legible, that is readable. And you start to act as if you were being viewed or watched, or if you were the subject of surveillance. So you start to practice surveillance on yourself. Surveillance becomes internalized in the inmate. And the power of this tower and the guard in it works through visibility. The guard is invisible, but you are entirely visible. And in it, self-discipline is created without force. Now, the idea is that you and me live in this panopticon. They don't need the prison anymore because you and me, you and I, have internalized this. We are what Foucault would call docile subjects, and that's how power works in our society. It's a completely new idea of power. So the panopticon, he said, is a political technology that serves to reform prisoners, but also to treat patients. So if you consider the way that hospital wards have been laid out, it's to increase visibility, reduce patients to numbers, put them in rows, etc. Instruct school children. When I went to school, we'd all be set in our assigned seats with names and so on. Confine the insane, to supervise workers, and to put beggars and idlers to work. It is a type of location of bodies in space. So Nicholas Herriman sits third row from the back on the left-hand side when I was at primary school. Of distribution of individuals in relation to one another, Carl Jensen is behind him and Michael Hooker is next to him. Of hierarchical organization, there's a teacher, and above the teacher, so the teacher is viewing me, and we used to call him the headmaster, now we call the principal, is walking past the classrooms, keeping an eye on the teachers. The disposition of centers and channels of power, for example, the staff room, the headmaster's office, as it used to be called, and the definition of instruments and modes of intervention of power, such as detention, which can be implemented in hospitals, workshops, schools, and prisons. So the idea is that I myself, being subject to this panopticism, now have adopted it and embraced it in my own life. Foucault calls it a political technology, but I'll also treat it here as a caring technology, because even if we go back to that plague, it's a way of stopping people dying of the plague. That's the way it's considered. It's a way of caring for populations that produces, according to Foucault, docile subjects like me. So let's look at how Foucault's analytical approach can be combined with Stevenson on government care for Inuit with TB. So obviously, when you've read Stevenson, you'll see that Stevenson is deeply influenced by this idea. So the connection is pretty simple to make. All right, so let's see how this works in relation to Stevenson's article. First of all, we can see care of populations. As you know, modern health care systems track people using health statistics, censuses, and screening programs. For the modern Canadian state in the 1950s, the Inuit were a population that in need of intervention. There were bodies to be managed and diseases to be contained. As Stevenson says, cutting these rates meant that lives are saved. Failure to cut them means those lives are lost. So the Inuit health was treated as a logistical problem that could be overcome through calculation and categorization. That's all good because, in a sense, you're reducing the TB rates, but this doesn't really account for Inuits' relations to each other. Like, for example, the man we read about who is now bereft of his mother, or his grandmother, who was a mother figure in his life, and this grandmother figure who probably died a lonely death in a train. So we can see this sort of relational element of caring being replaced by an organizational element of caring. And this is the kind of thing that Foucault's talking about in The Plague Town. The relation of every individual to his disease passes through the representatives of power. In other words, who I am and my relationship to whether it's COVID or the plague is understood through the representative of power, that is the authorities who are moving through the town in the 1600s looking at me in my window, or in 2020 doing a test of me and making me get inoculated. So the goal, of course, is to enable citizens to live longer and happier lives. It's not a conspiracy theory about the state trying to wrest control out of people. So it's not there are a lot of people who joined the Freedom Convoy during the coronavirus and became violently opposed to state control. The theory here is much more subtle because the theory here is that the government actually wants you to live long and happy lives, but it's going to take over and help you by organizing your life and making you legible, separating you into an individual element that can be treated and cared for. And for Foucault, this is the starting point of what we call governmentality. All right, next point is surveillance as care. So data, tracking and surveillance are necessary in order to deliver care. And this also produces visibility, accountability and control. So, for example, if too many Inuit die and I'm an administrator of this region, I'm accountable for that. So I need to track and surveil and manage the data of all these Inuit people. Similarly, if you're in the health ministry of the Australian state of Victoria in 2020, your responsibility is to track people who have COVID to ensure that they don't spread it to other people. So the CD Howe, this medical patrol boat, screened Inuit for tuberculosis and kept detailed records. One of the authorities said it is absolutely essential that we cover every possible Eskimo available. Bodies were recorded, tracked and sorted. They weren't just treated, but entered into a system of medical surveillance. And this is like what Foucault is talking about in The Plague Town. Everything that may be observed is noted down and transmitted. Surveillance is daily, every day, exhaustive, every single house in town, and linked to record keeping. You take notes and analyze those in statistics and so on. Care works by seeing, documenting life, and in doing so, quietly disciplines those it aims to protect. So the Inuit people become individualized elements that can be treated and cared for, but at the same time, the state is exerting more control over their lives. The next point is legibility or visibility. To treat a population, modern healthcare systems treat we're all a bunch of individuals to be separated, recorded, and made visible. This makes us legible to the state. So I have a Medicare number, I have records that the state can refer to if I get ill or whatever. Stevenson describes in the 1950s, there wasn't the technologies that we have in not 2020s, but every Inuit person was given a serial number which was written on a disc. So instead of a Medicare card, they had a disc. This was then worn around the neck as a kind of identity disc. This functioned as a social security number, enabling Inuit to access medical care. The authorities found this useful as it had been difficult to track the migratory Inuit. In fact, one of the authorities said the only legitimate way for a person designated as an Eskimo to interact with the state was as a solitary individual identified by a unique disc number. So, in a sense, in Eskimo, which was the old term, Inuit people are not even visible to the state without their number. And this correlates with what Foucault was talking about in the Plague Town, where each individual person is assigned his true name, his true place, his true body, and his true disease. So what he's getting at there is Foucault is that the government is producing a truth about you. It's recording, for example, for me, it's recording me as a name, Nicholas Herriman, an address, 49 Plenty Road, a body, male, age 50, what am I, 52, and whatever disease I might have, COVID positive or COVID negative. Power works by making individuals visible, analyzable, and comparable. It is a compact model of the disciplinary mechanism in which each individual is constantly located, examined, and distributed among the living, the sick, and the dead, in which power is exercised without division according to a continuous hierarchical figure. So what he's getting at here is that modern health systems don't just save lives, they make our life measurable, knowable, and governable. The final point, which is more relevant to non-settled migratory populations, particularly indigenous people in kind of frontier areas, is that modern healthcare settles populations to make it increasingly legible to the state. Modern housing and healthcare systems settle populations, make them visible, trackable, and governable. So care becomes a way to manage space and movement. So in Indigenous Australia, the Australian state would set up certain areas, designate them as town, create homes, so that people that had formerly been migratory or even nomadic were settled and could be cared for in a governmental kind of way. The idea was by doing this, they could save lives. So cutting these rates of death means that lives are saved and a mobile population becomes settled. In other words, they were building housing for these people, the Inuit people. It was to protect them, but it also produced a stationary, measurable, and ultimately, in the hopes of the administrators in the 1950s, an assimilable population, a population that can be assimilated into what they saw as modern Canada. So we can see this also in Foucault, this enclosed segmented space, which is the village, in which the slightest movements are supervised, constitutes a compact model of the disciplinary mechanism. The plague-stricken town is the utopia of the perfectly governed city. Discipline functions through spatial partitioning, in other words, bodies in houses, assigning bodies to places, addresses, fixing their movements, and observing them continuously. Care becomes a logic of. So much as in the plague in the 1600s, or for the Inuit in the 1950s, or even for Melbourneites, people who live in Melbourne in 2020 and 2021, care was a logic of containment, making us visible and governable. Now I need to reiterate, because it's very easy to think that to misunderstand this as a kind of conspiracy argument that the government is using this as an excuse to clamp down on us and monitor us. It's far more complicated than that. The idea is that the government has this intention to make us live longer, happier lives, and that we internalize this desire too, that we play along with it. We don't play along with it, we actually adopt it and incorporate it into our own sense of what it is to be a person, such that we become what Foucault calls docile subjects, that we make ourselves legible and measurable to the state. So the idea is modern systems of care, such as health, housing, and welfare, shape populations, making them visible, measurable, and manageable, and that this becomes internalized. We, people, internalize it and change our very sense of what it is to be a person. This is a non-violent technique of care. It's about statistics, surveillance, public information campaigns, which are ways to encourage people to live in ways that the government and state and we ourselves define as good, healthy, or productive. And we see in Stevenson's Life Beside Itself reading this week that these caring practices also function as control, and that they ignore, kinship ties between Inuit identity or even consent. But these are themes that we've seen elsewhere in the subject too. So for Foucault, care is always linked to power. And that's not new for us, because we also saw that even in kinship, that there's a strong hierarchical element. We also saw it in the work on saludos and remittances. But here we've also got visibility and the production of order by a organization that is like the state in general, or more specifically departments for health or housing or welfare. I suppose we could pick a number of concepts, but I'm focused in this presentation on governmentality and panopticism. Governmentality, which is the idea that by protecting and supporting us, the state also organises, sorts and regulates us. And also that modern care incorporates visibility and legibility. It requires us to become visible, measured, named, tracked or diagnosed. And the panopticism element is how we internalize this care, which means we try to be good citizens with healthy bodies, or we become compliant clients without being forced. So forget about force and forget about a conspiratorial government. It's something that we are willingly going along with. Our experiences of these, my own experience of the coronavirus lockdown, is also linked to global systems. In these ways, in the same ways, Inuit communities experience the TB campaign, there are some elements that are similar to the way a person in 2020 Melbourne experienced the coronavirus lockdown. But of course, with the Inuit people, there are distinct features from an Indigenous perspective. We can see, for instance, that formerly migratory patterns are closed down, whereas I already lived in a settled kind of life.